September 2010. The trigger was not a missile, not a sanction, not even a speech. It was a collision. A Chinese fishing trawler struck Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands. Tokyo detained the captain. Beijing protested. Cameras focused on diplomats, flags, and icy statements. But the real movement happened far from the microphones. In the days that followed, something stopped flowing. At ports across China, shipments of rare earth materials bound for Japan did not disappear. They were not seized. They were not banned. They simply did not clear. Paperwork stalled. Containers waited. Days stretched into weeks. No official order was ever announced. Inside Japanese factories, the effect was immediate and visceral. Production managers opened spreadsheets showing inventory measured not in months, but in days. Engineers stared at components that cost pennies but had no substitutes. Rare earths, names like neodymium and dysprosium, unknown to consumers, sat quietly inside motors, speakers, hard drives. Remove them and the machines fell silent. Japan was not a careless country. It was the world's most disciplined manufacturer. But its efficiency had a weakness. Just-in-time supply chains assumed that tomorrow would look like yesterday. They assumed that raw materials would always arrive. Now a question hung in the air. Unspoken, but terrifying. How could an advanced industrial economy be brought to its knees without a single formal sanction? How could a dispute over a fishing boat ripple outward, into assembly lines, into boardrooms, into global technology markets? The answer lay not in the collision itself, but in a structure built decades earlier, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when a hand would turn the valve. To understand why the flow could be choked so easily, the story has to move backward, long before 2020. Horyo 10, long before the collision at sea. Rare earths are not rare in the poetic sense. They are scattered across the planet, buried in rock from Australia to the United States. What makes them rare is separation. Each element clings to the others, chemically stubborn, expensive to tear apart. The process is messy, toxic, and unforgiving. Acid baths, tailings ponds, waste that no one wants in their Früher backyard. For certain economies decided this step was not worth the trouble, so the work drifted elsewhere. In the 1980s and 1990s, China made a choice that looked purely economic at the time. It tolerated the environmental cost. It built the refineries. It trained the engineers. While others focused on design and branding, China focused on the part of the chain everyone else wanted to forget. By the early 2000s, most of the world's rare earth processing had quietly concentrated inside its borders. Japan understood this better than most. Its companies were not naive. They knew the risk. But efficiency has a logic of its own. When one supplier is cheaper, faster, and always available, alternatives look wasteful. Redundancy feels like paranoia. Just-in-time systems reward trust, not suspicion. So Japan optimized. Inventory shrank. Warehouses emptied. Components arrived exactly when needed. No earlier, no later. The system was beautiful and brittle. The trap was not that Japan depended on rare earths. It was that it depended on a single choke point in the chain, the step between raw ore and usable material. Control that step, and you did not need to mine more. You did not need to announce anything at all. All it took was time. A few delayed shipments could be dismissed as logistics. A few more became a pattern. But by the time the pattern was visible, the clock had already started ticking inside every factory. And the most dangerous question was just beginning to form. If this could happen once, without warning, what else in the global economy rested on the same invisible assumption? The immediate cause was simple enough to explain. at least on paper. On September 7, 2010, a Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the disputed Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands. The captain was detained. For Japan, it was a matter of law enforcement in territorial waters. For China, it was a provocation, a humiliation, a test of resolve. Diplomacy moved fast and slow at the same time. Protest notes were exchanged. Ambassadors were summoned. Public language hardened. Then came the demand. Beijing rarely made so openly. Release the captain. Immediately. Tokyo hesitated. Releasing him too quickly would look like submission. Holding him too long would escalate a dispute neither side claimed to want. While leaders measured words, something else adjusted itself quietly. At Chinese ports, customs inspections grew more thorough. Export licenses were checked again and again. Containers that once cleared in hours now waited days. No memo circulated announcing a ban. No law was changed. Every official could plausibly say they were simply following procedure. For Japanese buyers, this ambiguity was paralyzing. There was no order to protest, no regulation to challenge. Suppliers in China offered vague explanations. Delays, they said, administrative issues, temporary confusion, but the pattern was unmistakable. Rare earth shipments bound for Japan slowed to a crawl. Inside Japanese ministries and corporate headquarters, alarm spread. This was not a sanction in the traditional sense. It was something more elusive, a pressure applied below the threshold of formal retaliation, where deniability lived. If confronted, Beijing could say nothing had changed. And technically, it hadn't. That was the brilliance and the danger of the mechanism. It weaponized uncertainty. How do you respond to a punishment that officially does not exist? How do you retaliate against a lever no one admits to pulling? As the days passed, Tokyo faced a narrowing set of options. Release the captain and appear weak. Hold him and risk deeper economic pain. Or search for leverage of its own in a relationship where supply chains had already chosen sides. The captain would soon be freed. But by then, something far more valuable had already been taken. The assumption that trade would remain separate from power. The mechanism was never dramatic. That was the point. There was no proclamation from Beijing, no headline declaring an embargo. Instead, the pressure moved through the narrowest part of the system, where discretion already existed. Export quotas, licensing approvals, port inspections. Each step legal on its own. Together, a gate. Rare earths move through the economy like blood through capillaries. They are ordered in small volumes, often tailored to exact specifications. Japanese manufacturers did not stockpile them because stockpiling defeated the logic of efficiency. When the flow slowed, there was no buffer to absorb the shock. This was not about mines. It was about processing. By 2010, China dominated the conversion of raw rare earth ore into oxides and metals usable by industry. Control that stage, and you controlled timing. Control timing, and you controlled production schedules half a world away. The chokepoint worked like a valve on a pipeline. You did not need to close it. You only needed to turn it slightly. A week's delay in customs became a month-long backlog downstream. Japanese firms running just-in-time systems began to miss delivery windows. Assembly lines were redesigned on the fly. Managers were forced to choose which products deserved the remaining material. And because nothing was officially stopped, there was no clear enemy to confront. Japan could not accuse China of violating a treaty that had not been visibly broken. Corporations could not sue over contracts that were technically still being fulfilled, just not on time. The entire system depended on good faith. The mechanism exploited that dependency. This was leverage without fingerprints, a form of pressure that lived in the gray zone between commerce and coercion. It punished concentration, not consumption. It targeted speed, not volume. And it revealed something unsettling. In a globalized economy, the most powerful tools were no longer armies or tariffs, but bottlenecks hidden in plain sight. Whoever controlled them did not need to shout. They only needed to wait. The question now was how long the rest of the world could afford to wait before the cost became unbearable. The consequences arrived faster than diplomats expected and deeper than anyone admitted publicly. By late 20th century, prices began to detach from reality. Dysprosium, a heat-resistant rare earth used to keep magnets stable inside electric motors, surged more than 20-fold within months. Neodymium followed. Materials that had once been an afterthought on procurement lists became line items capable of sinking an entire product margin. Inside Japanese firms, panic did not look like chaos. It looked like meetings. Engineers were summoned to find substitutes for elements that had no true substitutes. Motor designs were altered to use weaker magnets. Performance was sacrificed for survivability. In some cases, production simply stopped. Not because demand had vanished, but because a few grams of material could not be sourced at any price. Executives faced brutal arithmetic. Which product lines would receive the remaining supply? Automotive motors or consumer electronics? Export contracts or domestic obligations? Each decision created winners and losers inside the same company. Efficiency, once a virtue, now forced triage. The shock did not stay in Japan. As Japanese firms scrambled, their customers felt it next. Global electronics manufacturers began asking uncomfortable questions about their own exposure. If Japan could be shaken this quickly, who was next? Rare earth sat inside wind turbines, smartphones, missiles, and medical equipment. The panic spread not because supplies vanished, but because trust did. What made the moment especially destabilizing was its invisibility. There was no announcement to anchor expectations. Markets hate silence more than bad news. Prices swung wildly as buyers hoarded, amplifying the shortage they feared. A mechanism designed to apply pressure quietly had triggered something louder. Systemic anxiety. And yet, for all the damage, the pressure remained deniable. Shipments still arrived, eventually. Contracts were not formally broken. From the outside, it looked like turbulence. From inside the factories, it felt like suffocation. The realization settled in slowly and then all at once. This was not a temporary disruption. It was a message. And the message was simple. Dependence could be activated on demand. The next question was unavoidable. How do you fight a weapon that leaves no official trace? And how long before the rules themselves are asked to intervene? When markets panic, governments eventually follow. By 2011, what had begun as a bilateral shock between China and Japan had widened into a systemic concern. Prices were still volatile. Supply chains were still distorted. And behind closed doors, policymakers in Washington and Brussels were reaching the same conclusion Tokyo had already reached. This was not just Japan's problem. In 2012, Japan, the United States, and the European Union filed a joint case at the World Trade Organization. The charge was narrow, but significant. China's export quotas, duties, and licensing restrictions on rare earths, tungsten, and molybdenum violated its WTO commitments. The language was legal, careful, stripped of geopolitics. The goal was not punishment. It was precedent. The case moved at the speed international law always does. Slowly, evidence was gathered, arguments were exchanged. Years passed. In 2014, the WTO ruled against China. The appellate body upheld the decision. On paper, the rules had won, but by the time the verdict arrived, the damage had already been absorbed. Factories had adapted or suffered. Prices had already peaked and collapsed. The shock had done its work. The lever had been pulled, and the lesson had been delivered. This exposed a deeper asymmetry. Trade law operates on documentation and declarations. The pressure Japan experienced operated on delay and discretion. You could challenge a quota written into policy. You could not easily litigate a shipment that arrived 3 weeks late instead of 3 days. China complied with the ruling. Quotas were dismantled. The legal structure changed. But something else remained untouched. The concentration of processing capacity, the expertise, the physical infrastructure. The choke point still existed, even if the rules around it had been rewritten. For Japan, the ruling was vindication without relief. It proved the system could respond, but only after the fact. Law had a long memory, but a slow reflex. And that raised a more unsettling question. If legal victory could not undo vulnerability, then what exactly was the battlefield? And where should the next fight be fought? Courts, factories, or somewhere deeper in the structure of globalization itself? Japan did not respond with speeches. It responded with engineering, contracts, and time. Even before the WTO ruling, Tokyo had begun to act on a quieter front. The lesson of 2010 was not that rare earths were dangerous, but that dependence without redundancy was. The response would not be fast. It could not be. Escaping a structural trap never is. Japanese trading houses and state-backed institutions moved first. Long-term supply agreements were signed outside China. Investments flowed into processing projects in Australia and Southeast Asia. Risk was deliberately reintroduced into a system that had once prized frictionless efficiency. Costs went up. Stability slowly followed. Inside factories, the work was even harder. Engineers were tasked with the impossible, design products that needed less of the materials that made them competitive. Motors were redesigned to reduce dysprosium content. Recycling programs expanded, extracting rare earths from old electronics at industrial scale. Each gram recovered was a small act of insurance. None of this made headlines. It took years before these efforts showed up in trade statistics. But gradually, Japan's exposure narrowed. Not eliminated, rare earths remained essential, but diversified. The valve that had once been able to close with a single hand now required several. This transformation carried its own cost. Margins thinned. Development cycles lengthened. Perfection was traded for resilience. Japan learned to live with inefficiency by design. And yet this was not a clean escape. Much of the world still relied on Chinese processing. Many of the alternative supply chains still fed back into the same ecosystem. The trap had loosened, but it had not disappeared, which led to a troubling realization. If Japan, with its capital, technology, and discipline, needed a decade to partially unwind the dependency, what chance did smaller economies have? And if the cost of resilience was permanently higher prices, who would be willing to pay them before the next crisis forced their hand? The paradox revealed itself only with distance. The pressure applied in 2010 was meant to signal strength. It demonstrated control over a strategic resource at a moment of political tension. In the short term, it worked. Prices surged, factories stumbled, governments paid attention. The lever proved real. But leverage, once used, teaches its target where to look. As Japan diversified and others took note, the lesson spread. Rare earth dependence was no longer a niche concern of supply chain managers. It became a strategic variable. The very act of constricting the flow accelerated efforts to route around it. New mines were reopened. Processing research, once dismissed as uneconomic, received funding. Substitution, once an academic exercise, became a commercial priority. The power of the choke point began to erode, not overnight, but steadily. Markets adjusted. Buyers learned to hold more inventory. Designers learned to tolerate less performance in exchange for security. The valve still existed, but it no longer controlled the entire system's blood pressure. For China, this was the unintended consequence. The demonstration of power invited scrutiny. and scrutiny invites competition. The world did not decouple, but it did hedge. This is the quiet irony of structural coercion. The more effectively it works once, the less effective it becomes over time. Every use carries the seed of its own dilution. Yet, the paradox cuts both ways. Diversification is slow and expensive. It requires crises to justify costs that efficiency alone never would. Without the shock of 2010, the world might still be asleep. With it, the world woke up, but not fully free. So the question shifted again. If the trap could no longer close as tightly as before, who was now locked inside it? The one who depended on the flow, or the one whose power depended on others fearing it? Today, the containers still move. Rare earths still cross borders. The crisis of 2010 feels distant, almost historical. But the structure it exposed never disappeared. The world learned that supply chains are not neutral. They remember past shocks. Inventories are larger, now. Contracts are longer. Governments speak openly about strategic materials. What once lived deep inside procurement spreadsheets now appears in national security briefings. And yet the dependence was never fully broken. Processing capacity remains concentrated. Expertise remains uneven. In moments of calm, efficiency creeps back in. Costs are trimmed. Redundancy is questioned. The old logic waits patiently for memory to fade. The rare earth episode did not end with a clean victory or defeat. It ended with mutual suspicion. Japan became more cautious, more resilient, but also more expensive. China retained its central role, but learned that leverage, once displayed, is never invisible again. This is the final irony. The choke did not collapse the system. It bent it. And in bending it, revealed how fragile modern power really is. Not built on ownership alone, but on trust that tomorrow will look like yesterday. So the question lingers, unresolved. In a world tied together by materials no one sees and processes few control, who is truly locked in? The buyer who fears disruption, or the supplier who must never use the lever too often? Because the most dangerous traps are not the ones that snap shut. They are the ones both sides are afraid to touch again.